thanks everyone for, well, I suppose for the day, and this is the last session. So the point of this, I suppose, is to try and draw together a number of themes that were raised during the very interesting presentations earlier. And the aim as well is to open it to the floor to get, so feel free to chip in. So what I thought, well, what I'd planned to do is not what I'm going to do. So I've been making notes in everyone's paper, and I was going to ask some questions, but I think I'll leave it, make it a bit more general than that. So, but to kickstart it, I have two questions, I suppose. One, I'd maybe like the panel to think generally, I suppose, about the limitations of conventional methodological approaches to studying hidden crimes in general, but trafficking, I suppose, in particular, just to get your take on that. The second, and maybe Kevin can speak from back there, was I was trying to think about the actual utility of terms such as slavery and enslavement to understanding what we're talking about. I'm wondering maybe would another term, exploitation or whatever, be more suitable? Slavery to me is a very, very emotive term, I think. I think it's in a sense maybe overridden with a number of assumptions and values. So that's I suppose my second one. The second question, I suppose, to the panel, the utility of the discursive terms that we're using, and the first question, then the general one, is the utility of conventional methodological approaches to studying hidden crimes in general, but maybe trafficking in particular. So whoever wants to.
Well, would unfree labor be a better term than slavery for you?
I
mean, if slavery captures...
5 minutes, so let me, can I just
run
away when no one can beat me up?
Hit and run.
There's this thing that we know from human history called slavery. And it's a very clear set of behaviors and relationships. And it's true that it's got lots of layers of meaning on it, and people have interpreted it in many different ways. And it's true that the discourse around it, particularly when people believed there was no more slavery in the 20th century, mid-20th century, when people began to say, well, if there's no such thing as legal slavery, there's not slavery anymore. There was a tremendous dilution of the term and the adoption of the term by other people and other groups who wanted to dramatize their issue by calling it slavery. So marriage becomes slavery, any person who's in prison becomes slavery, organ trafficking becomes slavery. There was once in the United Nations Working Group on Contemporary Forms of Slavery, a delegation came to us and said all incest should be termed slavery by the United Nations, and so forth. And why? Because there was no more slavery anymore, so the word was up for grabs. But I resist absolutely the idea that we take something that has been known and is very clear in its fundamental definition throughout human history. It has fuzzy edges, but the center of this can be very clear. And to say, let's rename this, right? Let's call it by another name, because we're not comfortable with the way the word has been used, any more than when you look around today, for example, in environmentalist issues, or sometimes even in literary criticism, people use the word rape, as if it's okay to talk about raping a pasture, raping the text of a novel, raping, well, rape is a thing too. It's a particular action, a set of relationships and outcomes that I don't think we help the word rape by taking it off that thing that everyone has understood for millennia and saying, well, we're uncomfortable with this word, we're going to call it something else, we're going to call it sexual assault with intent or what, I don't know why. Well, slavery is slavery. Yeah. And I think if you go to the point where you accept that slavery is slavery, that we've been calling it this for a very long time, that people understand it very well. And it's unfortunate, yes, that it still exists now in the situations where it can be seen in very different formats, but it's always been seen in many different formats. From the, it's there in the first human written records. The very first cuneiform clay tablets talk about slavery. It exists all the way through history. But the fundamentals of what they describe when they, as you move across all of those languages and literatures, are situations in which one person is under the control of another person, fundamentally. And that normally that exploitation is used to derive some kind of advantage or profit. And that it has this indeterminate time length and so forth. That's what they describe. Now, they wrap it in packaging, as I was saying. It could be justified or rationalized in many different ways. But the core phenomenon of slavery is the same as it is today as it was then. Especially if you talk to people in slavery and you compare their accounts to the accounts of people in the past, and where they describe what is the lived experience of being a slave. It hasn't really changed. So, I don't want to do them a disservice. I feel very strongly that if we try to take away the name slavery from people who are in slavery today, and they're not allowed the legitimacy of their own experience, we're doing something at that point that becomes a violation of their right to have experience with experience. So, sorry, that was a little speech, but...
No, that's fine. Anyone else on the panel would like to come back to?
Yeah, I'll just mention one thing. I agree with Kevin, certainly, that if there are things that meet the conditions of slavery as it existed, absolutely, we ought to call it slavery. The problem that I see with that is simply that there are a lot of situations that I would call a person trafficked that don't necessarily meet the definitions of slavery. They're not in identity. Trafficking and slavery isn't exactly the same thing.
And you notice I said they are not the same.
Okay, that's fine.
Right.
So we're certainly not disagreeing then, or whatever else. But I mean, if you have someone, I'm picturing, blacks in the American South was held under those conditions, and if somebody here, is held under those conditions for, sexual slavery, absolutely, it's slavery, no question about it. But there are a lot of people, sometimes the debt bondage stuff, it's like, okay, well, we'll forgive this if this, and I guess you can go home. I mean, it's like, you don't get the same kind of feeling of total control. In some cases, in other cases you definitely do. The cases where you do, I agree with you, but there are other cases beyond that, and I want to talk about those as trafficking, even though I wouldn't necessarily talk about them as slavery trafficking. So, no problem? Okay, good.
Can I, being off the panel, just say that the legal definition, the UN definition talks about trafficking as a process of moving a person against their will for exploitation, and then exploitation is categorical. They give categories. So trafficking would be somebody who's moved against their will for servitude, for forced labor, for slavery, for their trafficking in their organs, for exploitation or prostitution. So in fact, the definition of trafficking is more than slavery,
Yes.
but it also includes the possibility for slavery. And in fact, the way things have worked out in legal terms is that this term exploitation, the list that they give, the categories they give, is at minimum. So that different governments have included, in the European Union now, so we've got 27, 29 states that have now also introduced exploitation as being people begging on the streets.
Yeah.
So if you are moved against your will, or as someone underage, for begging in the streets, that also meets the definition of trafficking. So there's a clear distinction in law between trafficking and these other types of exploitation, or as a means of different types of exploitation.
Okay. But like every morning when I drive into Queens, at 4 separate points along my journey, there are groups of, I'm assuming, Romanian men waiting at street corners to be picked up in vans, to be taken off to wash cars or whatever. So that happens every morning. They're out, and they seem fairly happy. They're standing there, chatting on their phones and whatever. But I was thinking then, in terms of Kevin's statistics, whether my Romanians are featured in his data, because it didn't seem to me that they are trafficked. But it seemed to me that Kevin was almost implying, to me, trafficking, I think, is a function of labour migration. It's basically what happens when someone moves from point A to point B to take a slightly better job than the really bad job that they might have in their home country, even though the job they end up doing is terrible as well. It's the jobs that none of us want to do. So I'm just thinking then, where would you see, Jean, the Romanian car wash person?
For me, the thing is that you've got this, in law, you've got this minimum standard, right? And and the trafficking definition works, right? These individuals, they may be moved and they may be exploited, but there is this issue of coercion. Are they being forced? Are they being deceived? So that's the first element of it. For me, also, the way I approach it is, what does exploitation mean? And exploitation means treating someone, taking unfair advantage over another person. Okay? But that unfair advantage has to be against some kind of criteria. And for me, the criteria is the ILO standards. And so you are exploiting somebody if you're paying them less than minimum wage. If you are not acting, and so it makes it very easy for me, if you are acting illegally, not providing minimum wage, not providing, paying for overtime, etc., etc., right? It's mild exploitation, but it's still exploitive. You're taking unfair advantage. And there's a reason why you're taking unfair advantage, typically because some kind of a vulnerability. And in the case of the Romanians, is because they are on a visa that does not allow them to work here. So and so you can exploit them as a result of that.
Mm-hmm. But that's ultimately then an issue around immigration policy, I suppose, at some level, not necessarily trafficking or whatever. No, I was just like, I don't want to hog this, but I was curious when Kevin made the point that people were going from Bulgaria to Russia, and he was sort of implying that these were, it was an involuntary type thing, when in fact, as far as I'm concerned, it's completely voluntary, because they think they're going to get a better job, albeit a really bad job in Russia.
I guess that both these things might be true, but these are just questions of fact, ultimately, that turn on the substance of particular relationships, particular circumstances. So any given movement between A and B may or may not be trafficking, just as any given exploitative or unfree situation may or may not be slavery or something else.
Yeah, well, I'm fully open to the shades of grey argument, but what I'm not...
Well, shades of grey argument.
Yeah.
It's a substance.
50 shades of grey argument.
The authors of the paper, the lead author is named Julie Pennington, and she is part of a cohort of graduate students and colleagues who have a connection with the International Organization for Migration. And when I met with her about 6 months ago to talk about her paper, to talk about the data, there definitely was a lot of areas of gray, a lot of shades of gray. The questions that were asked in the paper were essentially, has somebody in your family been forced in this situation, or led to believe that you think they were forced, where they didn't ask the actual family members, was your brother tricked into slavery, or something like that. So I think there is some shade of gray in the actual question wording, and then there's some shade of gray where the questions we're asking, were you in a family situation where somebody you know moved abroad for this reason or that reason? So you have these people bouncing around to different countries, and we don't know if they came back, we don't know how long it took them to leave the country or to sort of fall into this trap of coercion, and none of that is revealed in that paper that they wrote. So I think, or I wish the data could be more exact or more precise. But the gist, when I spoke with Julie Pennington and her colleagues at this conference, it was at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, the overall sense was what they were trying to essentially measure was, were these people falling into the trap of slavery? Were they falling into this condition where they wouldn't be able to get out of it? But when you bring up issues of how do you define slavery, or how do you say that that's a different phenomenon than, say, forced labor, then I suppose there are more shades of gray that, depending on how you define the word slavery, you could have a very different argument. Like those Romanians, I suppose. But I think in the spirit of fair debate and having an open methodology, the strength of that paper is that it's online. It's with the Journal of Macro Marketing, and if you just Google Journal of Macro Marketing, and if you Google the name Pennington, Pennington, it'll come up right away. And so actually, for any of the graduate students in the audience, what I'd invite you to do is look at the paper. It's a very sophisticated, methodologically robust paper from which we extracted those data points where we felt confident that, yes, this is measuring somebody falling into the trap of slavery. But that might be something interesting to revisit tomorrow during the graduate student Q&A session. But I like it how, you know, we're taking things to a discussion of talking about how to have the best measures in Cambodia using spectacularly brilliant research methods. I really think we're just at the dawn of a really, you know, spirit of methodological pluralism where we can have qualitative and quantitative methods, whereas 10 years ago, people were making up numbers, pulling them out of their ears, right? So I'm excited, but I think I just want to acknowledge the ambiguity that's inherent even in the word slavery, where we're still not really sure how to look at it. And from my view as an American, coming from the American South, where we had slavery of black and white slavery, today that term is very powerful to motivate students to fight modern day slavery. So we use that word in a way of almost leveraging the past so that we can have students feel as if they're more empowered in doing something that they feel good about. So we're almost taking advantage of the negative connotation of that word now in the States.
The Journal of Macro Marketing, there's that macro again.
Macro.
Right.
Macro.
But in terms of your second question about research methods, I would like to hear a little bit more from Tom, because I would consider these to be pretty unconventional methods. And I'm curious whether there are any deficiencies that you see in the type of method you used in Phnom Penh to estimate both the number of sex workers and the percent of them who you consider to be trafficked. If you had to do it over again, what would you change in that kind of research project?
Probably depend on whether I was doing it again in 2002 or if I were doing it in 2013.
Let's say you were doing it
And that's not a
again.
flip remark. I mean, things change. When we're supposed we were going to do that study here, would it work if we simply hailed a cab? And I don't know that it would at all. I don't know how people find this. I assume there must be outlets of that type here in town. Some people in this room perhaps know where some of them are. I don't know. But how do we find those? How do people normally find them? You walk into a bar here and you make friendly with the bartender. There are all sorts of
Internet.
ways. Okay, well, the internet's certainly a good place. Sure, there's a thing, I should not advertise it, but if you're familiar with the World Sex Guide, you can go to the World Sex Guide, and that will tell you a lot. But how accurate is the stuff on the World Sex Guide? That didn't really exist in that form, 12 years ago when I started doing that, and certainly not 25 years ago when I started all of this stuff in Bangkok.
But again, do you see any deficiencies, and I'm not saying there are, in the research you conducted in Phnom Penh?
Sure. Absolutely none. It's totally perfect. No, I don't know.
It's a leading question.
Yes, there are. I mean, there are all sorts of things that you could do better, but it's always a question of money, of time. Partly, it's probably a question of who do you happen to hit on as the moto. Some motos are going to know more than others. We tried to get rid of that by doing it for so many days with so many people and not stopping until we had 3 people, or 3 days of all of our people not being able to find another one to add to that map. It just didn't.
I'm thinking, for instance, you walk into a brothel and you begin to talk to the manager. How many of them were forthcoming with regard to answering your questions? How many of them were suspicious? Thought maybe you were undercover, I don't know, NGO people or law enforcement people?
Okay, well, let me start on sort of the negative end of that. That is a bad end, not a bad question. But there was one place in Phnom Penh that I went into once, answered some questions. Next time I tried to go in there, I was not allowed to go in. And so, that happened. But that only actually happened to me with one place, which is kind of surprising. I didn't just walk in, look around and say, hi, can I talk to the manager, whatever. You have to at least make friendly with the girls for a while, kind of talk and whatever. Nah, I don't think so tonight after 20 minutes or whatever, and then walk out, and then come back at another time. And ideally, what I had is I had a particular moto driver in Phnom Penh who was absolutely wonderful. His name's Steer, and he's become a very good friend of mine. And he knew so much about it, and his brothers were moto drivers, and the family, the father had been a moto driver. And moto drivers had a have had a lot of experience in brothels because when they're not busy, they often go in. In the older Phnom Penh, up till around 2002 or 3, it was almost all wooden. And on the various kinds of streets, the brothel doors would be shut. But when a motor driver would start to approach, suddenly they'd open almost at speed into a room about that size. This motorcycle would speed in with people standing around, would suddenly put on the brakes. You know, the passenger would get off, the motor driver would sit down and talk to the girls, and the passenger would go off with one of them. And you could be sitting there talking to the girls, and in some cases there's a mama-san instead of a manager. And often women managers are easier to talk with than men. Usually in Phnom Penh, I found male managers, when we call them usually managers, whereas in Bangkok, what you find is there's always a manager, but he manages the money. He's an accountant. And Mama-san normally manages the girls. The manager, male, normally doesn't want anything to do with the girls because they are fighting constantly over who's going with his lipstick and who whatever, and who's due to dance and who isn't, and who had the day off and other kind of things. I don't know if I'm answering you or not, but I'm just giving you my
You are, and
my head
in
tells me.
Bangkok you used a somewhat different approach.
Oh, definitely,
You
yeah.
didn't use the motor driver approach, but you had research assistants who went
Yes.
into various bars.
Well, in Bangkok, we already knew the places we were going to study, which means we probably missed a lot of places in Bangkok. But we were set out to study in Bangkok was the bars. And it's specifically designed for studying foreign customers, not just any foreign customer, it's basically Western foreign customer bars. There's so many places, there are brothels, there are bars, there are hotels, there are, cafe, name it, rice shops, cow tom, they're usually called. You can find it anywhere. Very little on the street. There's a real strong prejudice against streetwalkers, but almost anywhere. Well, what we wanted to study was that specific area, initially at least, and then we expanded, that was looking at Western foreigners. Now that turned out to be a lot of also Asian foreigners and a lot of others. So we got Aussies, we got European in addition to American, we got just about everyone. But in knowing where we were going to go, we didn't have to have a location method. We already had the locations. They advertise in Bangkok. I mean, and if they don't have enough money to do it, they're located next to somebody else who does advertise in smaller place. So, we didn't have that part of it to do, to find it. All we had to do was find a method of doing it. Maybe I can take a moment and tell you one story that one very quick thing that I learned. I didn't understand completely the relationship between the police in Bangkok and the other thing, because it was real obvious that the police had to know what was going on, even though it's illegal. In 1960, there was an act passed, I think it's the 1960s Act, I can't remember what it is right now, it's in my book, I don't remember all the names. But basically, for the first time, public nudity and sex work were disallowed. However, at the same time, through that act, the 1966 Act, it became legal to run, quote, entertainment places, which always means a place where sex can be offered, but not to have sex workers work in those places, which is very nice. So anytime you have an NGO worker, particularly a female, that comes in, do you have all these sex things? Well, absolutely not. There are laws against it. We follow those laws. Anytime you have a business guy or male of almost any type come in, oh yeah, sure, it's available to come in. So they could play both ways under that kind of law. I didn't understand what was going on. I was in an upstairs bar in Patpom, and it was a bar that had a stairway up here, a bar over here. I was sitting over here, and I could actually see the mirror, a reflection of it. I could see part of the way upstairs. As I'm looking, the people are naked, dancing on stage and everything, customers cuddling people all around. And coming up the stairs, there's a cop in uniform. And I'm looking for Mama-san to see how she's going to react. I'm not going to sound any alarm. What's going on? The cop walks up the stairs or whatever, and as he gets almost to the top, suddenly a bell rings. Wham! The slips all come up to cover from here to here. They're half slips, but they're around the knees. They pop up. Everybody's suddenly very nice. When the cop comes in, he looks around. Satisfied, he walks down the stairs, but I'm still watching him. I'm saying, what's going to happen? Gets halfway down the stairs, he suddenly turns and comes back up quickly. The bell doesn't ring. I said, oh, this is going to be fun. What's happening here? So he comes in. Mama-san walks over to him, puts her arm around him. He puts his arm around her, escorts him over to the corner, and three girls join him in the corner, quite naked. They spend the time in the corner. He looks at his watch, and he leaves. So I said, okay, I don't know what's going on. So I call Mama-san over, which is my method in Bangkok. Most of the time, ask Mama-san. She can usually tell you what's going on. And they speak at least enough English. So, I don't understand. Mai Khao Chai, cop here. What's going on? And she, you understand what? But not, she said, oh, very easy, very easy. Break. What? Break. What? Break. He is on his break. Break. That's the explanation. He was on duty at first, but that was time for his break. So he came up, sat down with the girls. As soon as it was time for him to be back on duty, he left. Ta-da. So it works.
John?
That explained to me an awful lot about the relationship between the police and how their laws were enforced and all that. So,
Were you going to ask something else?
The question I would have is about methodology, and in a sense, I understand the difficulties with sex work, but for me, I'm trying to make the distinction between trafficking, and so in that sense, you enter an establishment where there's some people that are working legally, and there are some people that are there against their will. But how do you do it in a situation of let's say, labor exploitation, where there's no public access, right? They're not selling a service that's open to the public, let's say agricultural work. How then, that's where in a sense the dark, for me, it gets quite dark, because they're far away from places where people are, access, you can't even judge in a sense. How do you go about trying to deal with those types of issues?
I think further complicating interactive factors are the role of culture. Here in the West, we may not consider selling our children or allowing your daughter to be used to pay off a debt, whereas in Cambodia that may not necessarily be the case. So if it's done with parental consent, then to what extent is that a version of slavery versus not being slavery, I suppose.
quick answer. Okay. This is my third report. It's the 2010-2011 report entitled Measuring the Extent of Sex Trafficking in Cambodia 208, pages 64, 65, 66, and 67 are directly on your question. How would you take this method and put it somewhere else? Okay. So I'm not going to read it to you, but I'll show you this. Anybody else who wants to see, or get the thing online, or just email me and I'll email. But I definitely did deal with that here. Doesn't mean you can do it, but I said, here's the way I would extend it if we were going to extend it.
I just want to ask maybe Sally and Jan if they think there are any aspects of the corporate crime or victim surveys that might be relevant to what we're talking about currently, or?
Oh, it's a difficult question. One thing that was interesting from my point of view was the Pennington study. There was a 3-item scale on slavery, actually. And, as I looked at those items, it appeared to me that I became more optimistic that something like this can be actually studied by means of a population survey.
Did you think the 3 items were leading or loaded? No? But they were kind of almost...
Related, correlated, or...
No, I
Loaded questions.
Yeah,
loaded. My first impression was that they were rather good items, and with regard to the question of the definition of slavery, just occurred to me that one practical solution is to regard the 3-item Pennington scale as an operational definition of slavery. At least within a particular study, you can say that slavery is what this scale measures. Of course, before coming up with such a scale, you need to reflect hard on whether it is sufficient. But once the scale has been created, there's a practical solution to the definition problem.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that the white-collar crime people have generally concluded is that because there are so many different competing definitions of what constitutes white-collar crime, and there is no, quote, legal definition of white-collar crime. There are only behaviors that fall under an umbrella that might be classified as white-collar crime. David Friedrichs has made the argument, and I agree with it, that you just have to be very straightforward in the research that you're doing, how you are defining your phenomenon of interest. And you're clear-cut about it. You identify how you're measuring it and how your data are interpreted, the strengths and weaknesses of them, and then other people can either replicate what you're doing or they come up with a different definition and collect the data differently. Now, the problem, of course, is that you can't do direct comparisons. But I think that that's been a way that we've resolved this 75-year debate in the white-collar crime area. I'd also like to touch upon this notion of whether or not slavery is an appropriate term. We have kind of the opposite point of view in the white-collar crime area, where business people in particular did not want to call what we were studying crime. And this is where the business people and the lawyers in particular were saying, this does not constitute the violation of a criminal statute. Therefore, you can't call it crime. And more importantly, no one's been convicted of a criminal violation, and therefore, they're not criminals. Now, Gil Geis, who just passed away in November, you may be familiar with Gil's work. Gil was a provocateur. And he loved using the term crime in front of a business audience because he thought that it was symbolic of the fact that this is a pervasive problem. And one of the only differences between calling something criminal and calling it illegal is that it's been that the behaviors themselves don't differ that much. It's that the evidence necessary to bring a case in criminal court is so difficult in certain white-collar crime cases that they solve it with a lower standard of evidence. But it's not that the behaviors themselves are that different. So I think that Gil used to always make sure that he called it crime. You don't call it illegality, you don't call it violations, you call it crime.
And Edwin Sutherland as well.
And Edwin Sutherland as well. And so following Sutherland's lead, that's what Gil always made the argument.
So or could you explain your preference, Sally, for corporate crime over white-collar crime? Because you said something at the start about that.
My personal preference is I'm very interested in organizations and power. And organizations give people an opportunity to use the organization as a means to commit their crime. And so that produces a somewhat imbalance in power, but it also gives them particular opportunities that they wouldn't have normally to engage in this particular kind of behavior. So as a sociologist, I was always interested in organizations, and therefore corporate crime as a behavior was very interesting to me as a criminologist. And because those are the organizations that tended not to be brought, their cases and violations were not discovered until there was some kind of scandal that brought it to the forefront. The smaller companies were often, in and out of in legal trouble here and there. But the corporations, they were the ones that managed to avoid discovery because of their organizational power. Or the suspicion is, and we don't know this empirically, is that they managed to negotiate themselves out of a formal conviction.
Susanna, I'm sorry, I saw your hand up there.
Yeah, I'm talking about terminologies. I think it's just a comment. I'm an anthropologist, and so what anthropologists would do in like all cases is to ask the people themselves how they define their identity or what they call themselves. And I find that we haven't really talked about that much. Like, do we ever ask the people we're working with, do you perceive of yourself as a slave? And some people might say yes, and others might say no, and it's interesting to look at like why they say that or why not. And then I still think we can call things, talk about slaves or prostitutes or sex workers, even though the people themselves don't call themselves that. I think that's still okay to do that. And yes, we need to define what we're talking about, but I think we also would be interesting if we started making more clear why are we using these terms. And you just said that earlier, like slavery is a very powerful term, and you're using it for political reasons. And I, as again, anthropologist, nothing's wrong with having a political opinion. And I think it's just very good to make that clear. And in the field of sex work, it's obviously, if you talk about sex work or prostitution, huge difference. You're positioning yourself, and then that's fine. We all have a position on these things, so it's just about sometimes making that more clear.
Good point.
The book by Chin and Finkenauer that I talked about earlier on the 7 Asian cities, they have very clear definitions of exploitation and the elements of coercion and deception. And they asked everyone the very same kinds of questions, and they were able to kind of get standardized responses, and that's why they could quantify, even though these were in-depth interviews, answers to those questions. They were very systematic, and it's one of the advantages of their particular study, and it's cross-cultural as well, which is an interesting dimension. So I think, that's the way to go, to have standard definitions of your terms. Exploitation is one of the mushiest ones. What does that mean? You defined it as being paid less than the minimum wage. They define it as
For
being able to
example,
bring home
could be.
less than 50% of your earnings. So we don't really have a standard definition within the discipline of what exploitation is. But as long as you operate with one and you make it clear at the beginning, then we can assess that.
Monty, you just want to come in there, then John, then not done.
In the States, I have a friend, her name is Holly. She actually has a blog. It's hollyaustensmith.com, HOLLY, Smith. She was trafficked when she was a teenager for 2 years in the United States, forced to have sex with many, many men. And today, when I speak with her, and I've gotten to know her pretty well, I'll say, well, as a survivor, how do you feel about this? And she said to me, well, I don't like the word survivor. And she doesn't like the word victim. She certainly doesn't like to be called an ex-slave. If anything, she wants to just be, acknowledged just as, like everybody else, so she can move on and do other things. So I think within this community of what I call survivors, there's a lot of struggle over the word itself from a deeply emotional level. However, I think she and others that I've met who are what I call survivors are sympathetic to the idea of using these words if they can leverage more political will and motivation. And it's one of those things where the more conferences I go, I always want to make sure that we can interact with more survivors, but I don't know how they feel about it, like being trotted out and put on display. But I know their voices are, to me, the most important.
But, okay, Tom, I want to come back to that Monty at some point, but Tom, you're going to...
You want me to just...
Yeah.
I just had one thing to say, and that is this. When you talk to somebody who advertises themselves as a victim, you just never know whether the person is a victim or whether they're playing that for personal advantage. I try to be exceptionally kind to any person. I don't say, are you really a victim? Don't do that at all. But in my mind, I make a great separation between someone who I can see clearly from the evidence, this person, wow, I can see from various things, not that they have said, but other things, where they were, when they said they were, different ways that they talk about it through my experience. I'd say, yeah, that person likely has been trafficked. From the very large number of people who are out on the speaking circuit, I was trafficked, hire me for $50,000 to come talk to your audience. I wouldn't touch most of that, but that's just me. I'm very suspicious of those things. And I fully understand the problems, but there are an awful lot of people who weren't, which doesn't in any way excuse me or anyone else from being negative or unhelpful to somebody who says that they were. It's a problem.
Quickly before I go back to John, I think Susanna raised a really important point, and I think it's something that's not completely missing, but missing from the research literature, this notion of an objective victim and how someone subjectively thinks about themselves, because even in terms of what I've been doing, looking at sex work, say, in Northern Ireland, a lot of media reports, even indeed government reports, academic reports, paint, and it's always women, they never really talk about men, paint all women as victims, when in fact I get emails from sex workers who say, well, actually, I'm not a bloody victim. I'm doing this because I want to do it. How dare they impose this definition of victimhood on me? I'm not some passive, whatever. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say about that. But John, sorry, you wanted to say something.
Just two things. One is about the definition. The definition's been busy for a number of us. About slavery, and in a sense it saves us from the problems that you've had with white collar, because there is a legal definition. And in a sense, I think Kevin would say that one of the weaknesses in his research and his work has been this definitional issue, because he was taking a definition, sociological definition, and saying this is what slavery is. But everybody was always after him about saying, well, that's your opinion, but where does that go? And in a sense, what we did was to say, well, here's the legal definition, and let's actually unpack that. And it turned out that by unpacking it and talking about control and talking about once you control somebody to use them, et cetera, that it actually mirrors the sociological. So in a sense, that was a happy coming together of this. And so it saves us from dealing with definitional, and then it benefits in the sense then of being able to do longitudinal studies, et cetera, because everybody's speaking from the same base point.
Yeah.
And that's, that's in a sense, hopefully, the outcome of this discussion about the definitions. That's the first. The second is that I was part of a group in Sierra Leone looking at the issue of forced marriage during the civil war in Sierra Leone. And there's two interesting things. One was that the notion of forced marriage was something that the perpetrators defined. They said this was marriage, and it carries on. But it was clear that it was not marriage in any conventional sense of a relationship, an emotional relationship. It was a stereotypical notion of a gendered notion of marriage. This was a woman. She cleaned, she washed, she fed, and it was free access. Thus, it was a marriage. Okay. And so, in the first instance, the question was: so here's the perpetrator who's hoisted this on, and it was internalized and accepted. And so we talked about forced marriage all the time, forced marriage all the time. And then the second part of it was to say, and the approach that I said was, well, let's look at it and let's put these criteria about what slavery entails, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, then it met that criteria. But then the question was asked, and it was a question that could be answered. What would these women think about this, of us from outside saying this wasn't a marriage, that this was enslavement, and that you weren't a wife, that you were a slave? And it's a question that wasn't answered at that point, but it's alive. To me, it's a fundamental question. Right? How do people, do we have in academia a responsibility beyond to be labeling things, and what does the person, the object in this think about?
Or did the women themselves feel that they were forced into it? Because if so, then that's all you need to know.
But did they define it as marriage?
Absolutely, but were they willing to? Because, the modus operandi is you go, you kill the men, and you rape the women, and then the commanders would say, this is yours, this is yours, this is yours, this is yours.
But is that not a bigger issue about, I raised the issue of marriage earlier, but women do stay in abusive relationships, even
and this was part of it, because then, not to get too far into it, but there was a good percentage, 10 to 20%, that internalized this relationship because they had children afterwards, and ultimately said, don't interfere. This is a marriage. No matter what happened, these are our children. This is my husband, etc.
They normalized it.
Quickly, sorry, Tom. Okay, quickly then, Dominic and Shan.
All right.
Did you have your hand up? No?
Mine's going to be very, very quick. But I'm just wondering how you would, or if you would extend that to India, particularly parts of southern rural India, where basically, girls are simply given by someone largely on the basis of dowry and bride price and various things like that. She goes to the husband's house. She becomes basically the kitchen slave of the mother of the husband. And yes, she does sleep with the husband at night, but basically she's going to be in there. If she can't bear a child, she's going to have an accident. She's going to burn to death in the kitchen. It's very, very common in rural India. She's got to bear a son. Girls, they're nice, but she's got to bear a son down there. It's a similar kind of situation in some parts of China, which is why you find a lot of the ultrasound devices in China. What's that going to be? You find a high proportion of abortion of the females' fetuses, based on that kind of thing. But I'm wondering, would you extend it to India? Are those marriages? They sound very much like what you're describing in Sierra Leone, but they're long, custom hundreds of years in India.
Or Saudi Arabia, or and lots of places in the Middle East.
It's kind of a Western
So if you
definition.
wouldn't in one, would you in? I'm just trying to put
Yeah,
fine.
But the thing I think that for me, there's to break it into 2 points, right? Is to ask, and I think we've established that there are objective criteria that you can say this person is enslaved, right? No matter what you call it, right? That's the first part of it. The second part then is the question about this type of is there an obligation to put an end to these types of practices that have historical roots, and then it becomes about issues of Western hegemony and all that kind of stuff around it. those questions that need to be unpacked, and that in a sense researchers have to work through. I think for me, I don't know the answer.
I didn't expect anyone to see what you say when I said it.
Dominic, you're sort of out in the cold there.
That's good, because I'm moving it on. Actually, I want to ask Sally a question I didn't asked this morning. It was really the only real view I've ever seen of corporate crime was through the film and the book Corporation. And my question would be, what do you think the future of our investigation and sort of our condemnation of corporate crime is going to be? Because as you were talking about, at times it could be a higher or lower priority based on other crimes. What do you think in the future is it going to become a higher priority because globalization and corporatization is become more powerful?
Well, the globalization of corporate crime makes it a very sticky wicket. It's who has authority to go after these offenders? Are they subject to the host country laws? Are they subject to the exporting country laws? Who's responsible? What kinds of powers are there out there to go after that? John Braithwaite has written kind of extensively about this problem, and it is seriously a problem. So I think it's difficult to predict where that's going to end up. I think there have to be institutional laws which then contradict. The United States doesn't want to subvert any of its authority to an institutional body, and I think a lot of the Western countries are like that. They don't want to give up their particular power. So I think those issues need to be solved before we can talk reasonably about strategies to control these global corporations. But I would say that one of the consequences of the more recent waxing of the corporate crime problem, and this began in the 1980s, also in the 1990s, and more recently, is that public opinion has changed about corporate crime. The argument has always been that the general public never viewed it as very serious. They never took it as a behavior as serious as street crime. And the surveys beginning in 1985 in the United States and then all over the Western world, these surveys that have been done, have shown an increasing sensitivity to corporate crime as a serious and consequential behavior, particularly behaviors that cause human physical consequences. And so environmental pollution that kills people, unsafe products that kill people. And those have been increasingly ranked higher in the scales, to the point where Frank Cullen and his colleagues suggest that it's had almost a perverse effect on punitive philosophies. In the United States particularly, there's been a get tough on crime philosophy for the last 30 years. And now what we're seeing is that it's get tough on everybody who commits crime. And we don't know necessarily that those punitive strategies are very successful generally, as opposed to even in the case of some of these corporate consequences, where there's no question that they've caused a lot of damage. The question is the punitive process the best way to intervene in those kinds of cases? So I would say that we've seen some substantial changes. I think people take it seriously. But I think Jack Katz was right. I think that it has become a politicized issue that could easily be removed from the center stage by something like a terrorist incident. And we saw that happening. The FBI lost a ton of money to go after white-collar crime after 9/11. There were even political cartoons that, had these people going, the money being taken in buckets outside of the white-collar crime shop and put into the Homeland Security,
Some would argue that's perhaps the conspiracy theorists would say that was a motive perhaps of it. They took advantage of that situation.
Took advantage of the situation, right, and depoliticized white-collar crime. But it's hard to depoliticize it because it keeps coming back. The mortgage fraud crisis and a lot of the accounting frauds and a lot of the securities frauds are just really hard to ignore right now. And I think that it has resulted in some political delegitimation in the United States and probably in other Western societies.
And much more media coverage as well.
And
which
much
feeds into
more
this.
media coverage, yeah. But can I just add a point that I think is very important, going back to interviewing people about how they see themselves. I did studies with people in the auto industry, executives in the auto industry, in the tire and rubber industry, and in the steel industry. And I got the opportunity to talk with executives. And I wanted to talk about white-collar crime, but I was really more interested in corporate crime. You know, this is my angle at it, right? But I thought, let me ask them what they think about white-collar crime. And so I asked them, tell me about white-collar crime. Tell me about white-collar offenders. Do you think any one of those people ever talked about a corporate offender? Not at all. White-collar crime were people of bad moral character. They stole from the company. They engaged in behaviors where the company was the victim. And they were morally reprehensible. And so when I tried to divert their attention back away from those people to the corporate offenders, what I got was the old bad apple theory. You know, this is just a matter of a couple bad apples who are spoiling the barrel for the rest of us. It's not a systematic problem. And we're being tarred and feathered for the actions of a few people. And so their perception of this is really interesting and kind of consistent with where law enforcement is on this. You know, the bad people are really the identity thieves, and they're the people that are out there engaging in these kind of individual level, self-interested behaviors. It's not the corporations that are the problem. So I just found that very interesting, to get their perception, just asking them point blank, who are these people? Tell me about them. Well, they're not us.
Hackers. They're the
Hackers,
worst.
right? You know, those, my son who downloads music illegally. Not that I know about that.
Any questions from the floor? Brian?
I suppose the big thing I came here to hear today basically is, you know, what is this dark figure then for human trafficking? I suppose in a way
You want a
that's
number?
a big question. So I just sort of asked myself the question there, am I any further on now than knowing what that figure actually is? I was just wondering from the esteemed panel, you know, whereabouts do you actually think it is? How underrepresented is the figure for prosecutions, for example?
I can't answer that directly. I would if I could. What I would do is I would take a look at some of the figures, like some of those that I've looked at. What is it that's put out there by various people? What are the different numbers? Usually what happens is that those figures are very large, and when you look at it from the stuff that I've done, the actual figures are very small. So how do we define the dark figure? The dark figure is that unknown trafficking, yeah, but there's sort of a separate dark figure. Do we call it a light figure? I don't know. But there's another figure in there where there's a huge exaggeration in the numbers. And so maybe what you're looking at is not a dark figure, but a light figure. And I don't know that, or maybe there's a medium shade. I don't know what the heck it is. But
All these shades of gray.
yeah, shades of gray, very good. I knew there was a dark. But it's like what a dark figure. Okay, so we can't. There are people out there that we don't know about. Yeah, but maybe we need to try harder. We need to find those people. There are clearly people that we have not found who are trafficked and who are in need of help. I don't doubt that at all. I think that the numbers of them is some percentage. It could be 100% or more, but it's some percentage of the known kinds of victims. But what we're getting in addition to that, those people that we don't know about who are trafficked, which is a real problem. We also get a lot of people who I think don't really exist, who just appear as numbers in other people's data sheets.
Well, anecdotal information tends to get extrapolated, and,
Yeah.
and this is the case in corporate crime too. You take the Enron, and that is a highly unique case, but it's extrapolated to account for all of the corporate crime out there. So you've got that anecdotal case that then becomes the normative case from which people extrapolate.
For me, Brian, I think I'd almost turn your question around and you know, maybe think about, everyone thinks that, you know, okay, it's a dark figure and the real figure is much, much higher, but to me, an equally interesting empirical question is what in fact if it's lower, you know, because okay, take 10-year-old axe murderers, like, you know, what is the dark figure of that? And I'm guessing it's like there isn't a dark figure of 10-year-old children who use axes to kill. So
15 of them.
Yeah. So I think Hazel Cree and her colleagues well at Edinburgh University, but they have a paper on child trafficking for sexual exploitation, and they ask these kinds of reverse dark figure questions, you know, that everyone's assuming it's higher, but what in fact, empirically, if it is really lower, that, you know, so anyway, that's what I would maybe think about. I don't know if anyone else. John, sorry.
Yeah. Well, for me, one of the questions would be is where does the dark figure in criminological studies, is there an area where you can say, well, the dark figure actually is pretty accurate, pretty close? Is there any area where we can say it's pretty close?
10-year-old
Yeah, that's worth replicating or learning lessons from, or is it the situation of the crime that allows us to, you know, is it bracketed in such a way that the dark figure can be deduced?
Well, maybe homicide in general.
Homicide.
So it's a little more serious in that sense, because the resources are put to it.
And there's a body often. I mean, the evidence is pretty strong in homicide
It's
cases.
difficult to
But
hide.
is it that the evidence is quite strong, or is it that the resources are put there to
Both,
gather
like,
the
yeah.
evidence in such a way that
But it's also the fact, you know, that film, the Belgian film, was banned a few years ago, Man Bites Dog, and basically it's about how difficult it is to actually dispose of a human body, and that's what the film centres on. So, you know, the evidence is always going to be there at some level,
And you've got widespread condemnation. Everybody agrees if they find a body or they walk past the body, I've got to report this. This is something
Right.
huge just happened, and it doesn't go for you know, even something well, all sorts of other crimes. We walk past all the time. Somebody will take care of that. Somebody won't take care of that. But a dead body, you've got all the eyes on the street helping you out with those reporting, and I think that's a big thing.
then I suppose that begs another set of questions about, you know, why are the figures so inflated then in the first place? You know, what's driving the kind of bigging up of data?
I'll give you one on that. It's money, okay? It's money, pure and simple. The U.S. government particularly spends all this money on NGOs, and they all want it. I mean, go over to Phnom Penh now. Over the last 10 years, almost all the streets are paved. They were paved before the Khmer Rouge. The Khmer Rouge paid people to dig them all up. They went to the city and go back to the countryside. But back in those days when I was first there, when the streets were all dirt, all you'd see are these huge SUVs. They'd go roaring up and down. And then when you followed them back, they went to some NGO. And you went in and said, well, who's driving all these NGOs? Oh, well, they're all these foreigners, Americans, British. I mean, there are various people, the heads of these NGOs. You get any kind of data that you can get. These guys are making $100,000 a year doing this stuff over there. However, they also get college kids and everybody is, oh, these poor trafficked people, let's go over here. And they do all the work, but they don't go out into the countryside. They write reports about what's going on in Spey Ring and, you know, various kinds of places, but they've never been there. And the reason you can tell that is every once in a while you get into a fight with them and you say something about it and they say, ha, but you have forgotten all these cities. And the cities don't exist. It's a function of a problem that the government has in the way that it defines urban and rural. Anyway, and they clearly haven't been there. I mean, they haven't been there. They're giving the government and sometimes will take a province and give the entire figure as though it all existed at a single central point, which then looks like a city, but they don't know that.
A political economy of figures out there that they have their own currency and they're used for, manipulated for.
I'm not sure I understood the question.
Sorry, no, I'm just saying, do you think the fact that the data are manipulated for resource purposes by...
But something has to define the phenomenon as worthwhile. It has to come to somebody's attention that this is something that we want to study, that we're taking seriously, that it's under-resourced. So how is it, what is the process through which that happens?
And my answer to that would be, in addition to money, it's vested political interests. In terms of sex trafficking, most of that is being driven by anti-prostitution organizations who want to abolish prostitution, not trafficking. I put the quotes up
And violence
earlier.
against women.
And so I think that's really driving a lot of that. And you mentioned these sporting events.
Yeah.
Like
Here
the
in
Olympic,
the U.S., it's certainly doing that.
the
Less so over
Olympics,
there, but
the
yes.
World Cup,
Absolutely.
the Super Bowl,
Yes.
the GATW. Global Alliance Against Trafficking in Women did a fantastic report looking at all of these major sports events and the claims that were made about the number of trafficked women to the events
Yeah.
and the evidence.
Nick Davies, right?
And, no,
No,
the
it was-
ATW.
Oh, really?
Well, Davies did another, the one Jean referenced
Okay.
this morning.
Right, that was earlier
Yeah,
though.
but-
And this looks at 7 or 8 different events around the world. And in each case, it was the media in alliance with anti-prostitution activists in South Africa, in Germany, who put these numbers out there. It's usually 40,000, a nice round number that can be repeated over and over,
Sink your teeth in.
year after year. And in Germany in particular, they discovered that it was people who wanted to embarrass the German government because it has legal regulated prostitution. And so what better way to do that than to claim that during the, I think it was in Frankfurt, the World Cup that year, that there were going to be tons, and I think maybe that's where 100,000 were alleged. And they turned up 4 cases of possible trafficking out of 100,000. So there's a real strong movement. It's not just about money. These organizations make a lot of money doing their research, advocacy work. They're invited to conferences around the world. They get a lot of status from that. But it's also they've got political interests. Now, and that's why sex trafficking gets so much more attention than labor trafficking.
Yeah, Donna Hughes, you
Donna
mentioned,
Hughes
is
is
one
one
of
of
those
them,
people.
right.
She's head of the Women's Studies Department at University of Rhode Island,
Right.
I think. I was on a panel with her. Sherry was there, as a matter of fact, and we were at tables like this. I sat in one place and Sherry was sitting next to her, and I kept shouting, Sherry, you're making nice to this lady, and we're both going to be killing each other up on the stand. But she is just absolutely out there. There has never been a willing female participant in any form of sex work. No woman, this is a quote from her, no woman in the history of humanity has ever been willing to go to bed with someone else for money. And I remind her of marriage in the first place and dating second as very good examples that are counterexamples to that. Only third would be prostitution. You know, the guy with the Mercedes who comes, picks you up, takes you out to a good movie, whatever else, does great things, comes back. Same guy comes back, however, or in a different girl or a different thing, comes in, takes you to the bus. The girl has to pay for the bus. He walks past the bars and says, yeah, I said I'd show you good bars. Here they are. What are his chances of, getting laid that night compared to the guy in the Mercedes? The guy in the Mercedes' chances are much better. They're not perfect, but money and sex are always related in humanity, okay? Women marry guys with money. When you look around with somebody like, who's this guy with the hairpiece and whatever, who owns all these things, I can't think of his name, but all the gorgeous women, oh, come on, they want him for what, his body? Come on. It's not even that.
Let me just add that that's just one example.
You want to say something?
What we're talking about.
Okay, Robin, I think, had something to say there, did you?
Yeah, I was wondering then about the kind of countervailing position, where I was thinking about your table one time where there were a few jurisdictions, Norway, the Netherlands, where the dark figure was at least out of kilter with the other.
Yeah, that's right.
And Ireland, at least comparatively low as well.
Yes, that's right.
Are there lessons to be learned there from this kind of?
Oh gosh.
Only if we can break it down by type of trafficking, and the figures didn't. They aggregated sex trafficking and other types of trafficking. So we need to separate those out and then see how these different countries stack up in terms of the number of identified people who say that they pay.
What we need is actually a survey dedicated, but the question is to do the kind of survey where 5 countries, 5,000 random samples, the amount of money you need to do that. But in the context, if you think about trafficking and slavery, you've mentioned, there's money there, right? But maybe there's not money in a sense to get to the point of being able to actually establish numbers there.
Dominic, did you have something?
Yeah, it was back to the point about the extrapolation of the figures. One point would be the crime itself, allows conflation of the prevalence, because we're obviously going to denigrate trafficking or prostitution. It's like Shannon Graham was talking yesterday. Hate crime, you're going to say, oh, that's terrible. Yes, so you're more. Well, I think you're more likely to blindly go with these nice round figures because you don't like that this exists in society, so you're just, yeah, that's exactly right, I'll go with that. And sort of just, like a collective voice, yes, we're all against this, and whatever the figures are, we're we're against it.
Although, fairly high percentages of the public in various European countries support legal, regulated prostitution. Yes, there is a lot of negative views of it that have existed for centuries, but still there are other views that are more moderate, more tolerant, and would like to see it legalized and regulated and brought into the light as opposed to forced underground and criminalized.
Yeah, well, I gave a paper on Tuesday, and one of the points I was making was that the public view, because I wrote an op-ed piece in the Belfast Telegraph, basically, which was a fairly mild critique of trafficking discourses, but I had more supportive comments from the public about the issue, compared to the complete hysteria from the various government officials and some NGOs. So I was sort of arguing there on Tuesday, when is a moral panic not a moral panic, or at what level do you need societal public reaction? And so I think at some level, and this is almost here in terms of the various legislative proposals, is driven almost independently from what the public think about the issues, because by and large, your average member of the public couldn't give a hoot about trafficking in particular, Okay, they think maybe it's a bad thing, but it's not something really that energizes them, compared to, say, child sex abuse or something, which would really get the public
I thought you were going to say child axe murderers.
Yeah, well, axe murderers as well, because when I started writing my paper, I did couch it in terms of kind of sociology of moral panics. I wrote all of my little bits. And then I thought, but there isn't a panic, there's no social reaction to this. So you've got this thing racing ahead in the absence of public concern. So then, for me, I suppose conceptually, empirically, is to work out how you get a panic in the absence of a panic.
Well, it's a moral crusade.
Yeah,
it's a crusade.
Yeah, so I reformulated it in terms of culture wars, I suppose, in terms of almost like what you get.
And I'm also thinking that it has a lot to do with people imagining themselves becoming a victim. And I think this kind of goes back to Ralph Nader taking on the automobile industry, coupled with the prosecution of the Ford Pinto cases, where people were dying in these explosions of Ford Pintos. Lee Iacocca was marketing these cars as, under $2,000, everyone can afford one, everyone can buy one, and there were a lot of them out there. And then suddenly they start exploding. And it wasn't an issue until Ralph Nader started, unsafe at every speed, and you've got this concern now that I too could be rear-ended and blown up, and so it's the identification, I think, of me and mine can be a victim of this. Yeah. That makes it more of a broad-based panic than a moral moral crusade.
I think that's right. Anyway, I'm just noticing the time, and I'm also noticing that acknowledge people have been here since 9 this morning. So any final questions from the floor or anything? Okay, I'd like to thank the panelists for a round of very interesting sessions, and thank you in particular for coming. I know some of you have travelled from very far away places. Also our panelists have as well. Right enough. So anyway, thanks very much everyone.
Papers should be available here soon. We're hoping this will be a special issue of the journal, so watch out for that. You've got Deglin's email, most of you, or else emailed us at the School of Law if you'd like to get copies of the papers, and probably when we get the whole thing, we can have an issue for you as well. Thanks.